about cognitive learning theories. This is really kind of interesting because we've already talked about cognitive theory of development. Now we're going to talk about the cognitive learning theories. They're not that connected, as interesting as this is. This has been the movement in the United States for about the last 30 or 40 years. We were we were following Erickson, then we were following Vygotsky and Piaget, and now with cognitive behavioral therapy, and these things aren't all always connected, even though they use the same word. And of course, I've gotten crosswise with these guys over and over again, but. So we're going to talk about the cognitive learning theory, and of course it has a lot to do with the structure of the brain and how people think. So let's go ahead and get into it, and maybe you'll see what I'm talking about. I've worked with cognitive theorists before, uh, uh, cognitive psychologists, and sometimes they're not that easy to deal with. Because you can't debate with them. There's one branch of cognitive psychology that doesn't believe in mental illness, which is always fascinating. I was working with a cognitive psychologist in Iowa, and it was just after the DSM-5 came out, and I bought a copy of it as soon as it came out. And I told him, if you ever need to look anything up, I've got the DSM-5, and he said I'll never have to look anything up because it's none of it's true. So, okay, interesting concept that mental illness doesn't exist. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Maybe there we go. Okay, chapter 5. Cognitive theorists differ from behaviorists, and of course that's what they're doing here. Um, they are talking about they're comparing the cognitive theorists with the behavior modification, behavior the behaviorists, the operant conditioning individuals, and the classical conditioning people, B.F. Skinner and whatnot. Cognitive theorists differ from behaviorists in that they emphasize the way that we think. If you remember, the behaviorists, everything had to be observable. If it wasn't observable, it didn't exist. For example, if we are looking at your performance on a test of this material, we could examine how certain rewards, good grades, or positive comments from friends or instructors work to alter your behavior, study time, and techniques. This would be a typical behavioral approach. Distinguish this type of approach from one attempting to understand your test performance by looking at your thoughts. Perhaps you love the material or see it as vital information to your future success as a teacher. Perhaps you are in the class with a friend and have a strong desire to perform better. Look at these factors and their impact on your performance is typical of a cognitive approach to learning. Again, the focus on what we think. That's the cognitivists focus on thinking. Behaviorists are focusing on observable behavior. The cognitive perspective includes theories and research related to an understanding of thinking and reasoning. This perspective includes research on a wide range of cognitive processes or mental activities: memory, knowledge, problem solving, attention, comprehension, and many other things. One of the best ways to develop an understanding of the cognitive perspective is to compare it to the behavioral perspective. The primary difference between cognitive and behavioral perspectives in terms of learning is in the interpretation of mental activities. And in this case, we're talking about thinking and reasoning. Both perspectives acknowledge that people have an elaborate mental life. However, where the perspectives differ is in the ability of these mental activities to alter our behavior. Cognitive theorists believe that mental activities play a direct role in the expression of behavior. This means that although environmental events are important in determining behavior, our thoughts can intervene and redirect behavior. The belief that mental activities influence the expression of behavior makes vastly different interpretations of learning possible. Unlike the traditional behaviorist view of the individual as a passive respondent to environmental changes, cognitive theorists hold that people actively think about their environments and behavior. They engage in mental processes like planning and goal setting, which have a direct bearing on behavior. Consequences, reinforcement and punishment, under the cognitive perspective, do not exclusively determine behavior. Instead, they provide us with feedback about the possible results of our behavior. We are able to consider this feedback and use it to help us decide which type of behavior is best. Again, consequences themselves do not determine behavior according to the cognitive perspective. When comparing the behavioral and cognitive perspectives, it is important to underscore that both behavioral and cognitive perspectives are theoretical. This means that each perspective is an attempt to explain human behavior. Sometimes students will ask, which theory is right? Both theories have research support that demonstrates their usefulness in certain contexts. At this point, it is not so much whether one perspective is right or wrong, but under what circumstances does a particular point of view become useful? The cognitive perspective began to gain prominence during the latter half of the 20th century. Feeling like the behavior has failed to capture the complexity of the human experience, cognitive theorists began to study how thinking impacted behavior. The movement toward a cognitive perspective was also promoted by the advent of the computer. Being able to design machines capable of mirroring some of the complexity of human thinking enabled cognitive theorists to develop specific models for how we accomplish thought processes like knowledge acquisition and memorization. Now, this is really kind of interesting because when I first started teaching in 1991, that was 2 years before the internet was invented. Computers, there were computers, but there weren't laptop computers. There were desk computers, but they were really big. Memory was floppy disks. There were no memory sticks, and the floppy disk held like 278 kilobytes or something like that. Not very large, very small, relatively small. I have 5 degrees. I have 5 degrees, and I acquired 4 of them without a computer. Um, if you can imagine, and I'm sure you can imagine. So I had to go to the library and do all my research. In order to find research articles, I had to look it up in a book and find the ones that I wanted, and then I had to find the article in a magazine, and most of them were in. They used to take a year's worth of magazine of journals and put them in a single volume. So that's how I acquired 4 of my 5 degrees. Only my PhD I acquired after computers were invented or computers became prevalent. And of course, databases didn't exist. They just barely existed by the time I finished, actually. So, and the whole point is that the cognitive perspective used the concept of computers to promote their ideas. They said, well, this is how we encode and we have to decode it. We have to find the right queue in order to retrieve this information. It's just like a computer does. And of course, at that time, computers were relatively slow, so it was easy. It was easy to compare the human brain to a computer. Now, of course, it's a lot faster, and comparing the human brain to a computer makes a little bit more sense now because our brains work very, very rapidly, far more rapid than most AI. And actually, it can think in a different scope than AI can. We can change subject material. whereas AI has to think in a linear fashion. It can't think in circles. It can only think in a straight line, as weird as that is. So yeah, I'm pretty old. I acquired my first degree in 1971, and my second in 78, and then my third in 79, and then a fourth degree in 1982. So this is way, way before computers. So I had to type everything out on a typewriter. As much fun as that was, and I don't type. Early cognitive researchers frequently employed a computer metaphor in the study of human thinking, comparing the way humans think with the way computers operate. This mind as computer perspective allowed cognition to be conceptualized as information processing. This view is based on the many similarities between human thinking and computers. As a matter of fact, we have put computers together in order, trying to mirror the human brain. For example, computers and humans both take in information, store this information, and process it in some way, retrieve it from memory, and produce an output. In fact, humans build computers and humans write computer programs. It follows that the way computers think mirrors the way that we think, of course, and that's what I was just saying. This is actually a mirror that's being used as a computer screen. Human beings share a remarkable quality with one another. We can retain a mental representation of our experiences. The common term for this mental representation is memory. Memory allows us to store little life experiences so we can better adapt to the ever-changing world around us. Imagine what life would be like without the ability to remember events or experiences. Every situation we encountered would be new, as if we had never experienced anything like it before. This would make it very difficult for us to alter our behavior to best suit a particular life circumstance. In fact, our only behavior would be that with which we were born through our genetic endowment. Humans are hardly limited to inborn or genetically driven behaviors. We have a highly developed ability to store new information. An infant recognizes her mother's face, preferring it to others, of course, at around the age of 2 months. When a toddler touches a hot radiator, his memory of the painful events allows him to alter his future behavior to avoid being burned again. A second grader is capable of remembering basic addition, which makes learning and understanding multiplication possible. Not only can we remember people, consequences, and information, but we can also remember events, images, feelings, and coordinated movements. There are a limitless number of everyday memory examples, and they are a testament to the remarkable complexity of memory as a cognitive process. Memories, however, would quickly become overwhelming if we did not have the efficient organization technique. Without organization, we would have an enormous store of information, but we would be unable to find relevant memories. The human ability to organize information allows us to find and retrieve memories. This storage of memories in a complex but highly organized reservoir of information is called knowledge. Knowledge makes it possible for us to match the face of the person walking across the street to the name Brent so that we can call him by name when we say hello. Knowledge allows a physical education teacher to temper her expectations regarding a second grade basketball game. She knows that young children have a different capacity for motor skills and educates accordingly. Knowledge is far from random or haphazard. The information processing model views memory as a process, the product of several step-like processes. The information processing model consists of three core components: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. According to this model, information flows in from the environment and is processed by one, two, or all of the components. The outcome of this process will determine the nature of our memories. In addition to the core components, there are also important cognitive processes serving to link the individual components into a single functioning system. These processes are generally referred to as executive control processes. These components direct the flow of information through the memory system and impact effectiveness. We typically underappreciate the vast amount of sensory information coming in through our senses every second of the day. Yet it is through this sensory information that we come to construct our understanding of the world. Sensory memory acts as a temporary holding system for incoming sensory information. The memory store appears to have unlimited storage capacity, taking in countless sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and physical sensations. Holding this vast amount of sensory information in our memory allows us enough time to select certain information for additional processing. Most of our incoming sensory information is not needed and is quickly lost from the sensory memory store, a process known as sensory decay. Research shows that the amount of time it takes for a particular sensory memory to decay depends on the particular sense, but sensory memory is always very brief. Visual memories typically last for about 1 second and auditory memories for about 2 to 4 seconds. The important point to remember is that while sensory memory may have an unlimited capacity, it also has a very short duration, lasting only a few seconds. Not all sensory memories decay. Some of these memories are selected for further processing through 2 mechanisms: attention and perception. Attention is a cognitive resource fundamental to storing memories. Attention directs sensory memories toward the next component in the process, working memory. Sometimes directing our attention is easier than others. Allocation of attention, I shouldn't have looked at this picture, it made me laugh. Allocation of attention resources is extremely important in the classroom. Even in the most engaging classroom environment, all students will be required to attend to tasks they may not be inherently engaging. If the student can internally direct their attention, they have a better chance of meeting with task success. Teachers face this situation almost every day. They stand in front of the class, provide directions, and ask the class to begin the task. Almost invariably, at least one student will miss the instructions and not know what to do. The teacher may be required to make important classroom information the most engaging aspect of the instructional environment. The supports may be simple, such as repeating instructions one-on-one. They may also require more effort, such as setting up a queuing system or posting written instructions. It should be noted that students have required more substantial support in directing their attention might be at risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD is a behaviorally defined diagnosis used to describe children who have a unique set of problems, one of which involves significant difficulty with directed attention. Perception is the cognitive process of assigning meaning to incoming sensory information. In the early part of the 20th century, a group of psychologists became interested in the role that perception plays in shaping our understanding of the world. Collectively, these psychologists were called the Gestalt psychologists. Gestalt is a German word meaning configuration. And these scientists were so named because they believed that our perception of sensory information depends on the form or configuration of the information. Research conducted by the Gestalt psychologists led to their outlining 4 basic perceptual processes. These principles are important to consider because they help us appreciate the degree to which we actively try to make sense of the world. Instead of always perceiving the world as made up of individual items, we actively seek patterns, forms, or meaningful configurations. Along with attention, perception helps sensory memories move into working memory. Attention and perception often work together, and perception often together moves into working memories, since it is not always enough to just pay attention to something. We may attend to a particular sensory item, but fail to make any sense of it, resulting in the memory being lost through decay. To actively process information, we not only need to pay attention to it, we must also perceive it as meaningful. It is easy to see how important meaningful context is in perception. It is often quite challenging to create such learning environments for all students. A student's cognitive development, level of knowledge, past experiences, or present skill level may not allow them to benefit from a lesson in the way that the teacher intended. By asking questions regarding student perceptions and carefully listening to the responses, teachers can develop responsive learning environments that maximize movement of sensory memories into working memory. The important point to remember is that students are actively trying to make sense of the world, and teachers can use this to help students master curricular goals. A factor to consider when trying to understand students' perceptions is whether they are building meaning from incoming sensory information or from prior knowledge retrieved from memory. Bottom-up processing occurs when an individual attempts to arrive at a meaningful perception by using sensory items to build an appropriate understanding. And if you look at this picture, if you see a horse drinking water, that's what a lot of people see in this picture. I'm going to show you the same thirsty horse. This is off the coast of Dorset in England. Looks like a horse. Interesting perspective, because we're going to see it again in just a second. And now we see what it actually looks like. That's a little bit closer to it. As you can see, it doesn't look that much like a horse. That was at low tide. Then that's at high tide. Meaningful perceptions can also be reached using top-down processing or using existing knowledge to guide our understanding of new information. It is important to remember that meaningful interpretations of sensory information may use either bottom-up or top-down processing, and both types of processing have implications for the classroom instruction. What we now call working memory was originally conceived as just another temporary memory store on the way to permanent memory, so it was given the name short-term memory. Later research revealed that both temporary storage and active processing occur in this immediate store. In fact, our conscious thinking and reasoning occur here. Working memory is a term that better describes a memory store where information can be both stored and consciously processed. The information processed in working memory may come from the sensory store or from long-term memory. Working memory also allows us to process incoming information from sensory memory to which we assign meaning based on information from long-term memory. In this way, working memory allows us to integrate our sensory experiences with information we have already learned. Extensive research has been conducted to better understand the information processing which occurs in working memory. Cognitive scientists have explored the duration and capacity of working memory, as well as information transfer from working to long-term memory. In 1956, George Miller, a psychologist, was haunted by the number 7. Researchers in the 1950s studying human mental function had repeatedly found evidence of limits on human processing of sensory information, and Miller couldn't help but notice these limits all hovered around the number 7. In the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, Miller outlined for the first time what has now become standard knowledge. The capacity of working memory is around 7 plus or minus 2 items. Let's build it back up. There's a 7. We're going to knock it down, explode it. Not only do we have limitations on the number of items we can consider at once, but also on the amount of time items stay in the working memory. Working memory has both a limited capacity and limited duration. The duration of working memory is around 30 seconds, and we're going to wait till this thing plays out. And that's how long your working memory lasts. The limited duration and capacity of working memory, however, can be altered. If the 30-second duration and 7 plus or minus 2 capacities were absolute, our thinking would be limited and inflexible. To achieve the incredible flexibility characteristic of human thinking, we need to have a mechanism for maintaining memories in working memory for longer periods of time. We also need a tool to think about more information at one time. The cognitive mechanisms of chunking and rehearsal help address these issues. He's on a hoverboard, and he's juggling soccer balls and one basketball. I guess we only see him catch the basketball once. We can increase the amount of information we process in working memory without increasing its capacity by changing the way that we think. In order to do this, we combine several individual pieces of information into a single meaningful unit or chunk of information. Chunking essentially allows us to expand the amount of information available in working memory without increasing its capacity. The cognitive strategy of rehearsal or repetitively thinking about the information increases the length of time information stays in working memory without changing the 30-second duration. Essentially, each time you think about a piece of information, the 30-second clock begins. If you think about the information again after 25 seconds, the clock starts over. There are 2 primary types of rehearsal: maintenance and elaborative. Maintenance rehearsal is a process of mentally repeating information currently held in working memory. And this is a good way to remember somebody's name, is to repeat it. So when you're shaking hands with them, you repeat their name. I've been around people who said my name constantly, and the reason they were doing that is because they were trying to remember it. But I don't have that common a name. My name is Bruce, and that's not that common. So I'm not that. At least my name is memorable. Maybe I'm not memorable, but my name certainly is. When a physical education teacher asks his students to get a soccer ball out of the storage closet, dribble it to the length of the gym, and line up on the west wall of the gym, the students are likely to continue to repeat the instructions to see themselves until they are to themselves. They're repeating the instructions to themselves until they are at the wall. This repeating of information can maintain information in working memory for an indefinite period of time. However, it requires constant effort. You have to say the name over and over. I'm sorry, you have to repeat the instructions over and over. It is also rather inefficient at getting the information into long-term storage. A more efficient strategy for moving information from working memory to long-term memory is to use elaborative rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal is a process of taking something you are trying to learn and connecting it to something that you already know. If students can create a meaningful association between a new piece of information and something that they already know, the new item will be much easier to recall. This is why it is easier to learn about the national deficit in social studies when you realize it is similar to asking your parents for an advance on your allowance. And this is actually the way that I remember numbers. I've moved a lot, so I've had a lot of area codes, I've had a lot of telephone numbers, and I've had a lot of I've just I've been around a lot of numbers. Anyway, this is the way I remember things because my favorite baseball player is Willie Mays, and his number is 24. This is how Charlie Brown remembered uh, his locker number. How do you remember 324-7? Babe Ruth is number 3, Willie Mays is number 24, and Mickey Mantle is number 7. I'm really lucky because my telephone number now has a 24 in it, and that helps me out a lot. So I don't have to remember the number 24. I just remember that the last 2 numbers are Willie Mays' number 24. And that's how I remember things, strangely enough. Hank Aaron's 44. Let's see, what else? How else do I use baseball numbers? Ernie Banks is 14. These are the old guys. Roberto Clemente was number 21. There you go. You remember these things, or I do anyway, because I'm a baseball fan. Barry Bonds is 25. I'm a Giants fan, so I remember a lot of Giants. 1974, Baddeley and Hitch proposed that working memory is not a single entity, but actually consists of 3 different components: a phonological loop for auditory or verbal information, a visuospatial sketchpad for visual information, and a central executive for the management of attention resources. Newer research has provided considerable support for this interpretation of working memory. Whoops, wrong direction. One of the most extensively studied of the components is the phonological loop. Phonology refers to speech sounds. Essentially, the phonological loop is a part of working memory that allows us to repeat auditory and verbal information. When we use the maintenance rehearsal strategy of holding information in working memory by silently repeating the information, the phonological loop is in operation. While the phonological loop is a fairly reliable system, it is susceptible to competition from new information that is phonologically similar. The phonological loop also appears to have some important time constraints, which are based on the length of time it takes us to say a chunk of verbal information. Research shows that we can only hold as much information in the phonological loop as we can say to ourselves within 1.5 to 2 second time period. Thus, the processing of information in the phonological loop requires a new constraint on the classically cited 5 to 9 items for working memory. While the capacity of the phonological loop is also 5 to 9 items, these items must take less than about 2 seconds to say. The phonological loop represents our verbal working memory, and it is very influential in learning a spoken language, since sound patterns linked to meaning are required for language learning. It also appears to be important for classroom achievement and is sensitive to the memory-enhancing instruction. Children who experience problems with the functioning of the phonological loop may show speech and language delays. The efficient operation of the phonological loop is often used as an indicator of intellectual potential. The Wechsler Intelligence Tests includes a digit span subtest, which measures short-term auditory memory. Research on the phonological loop and intellectual ability show that phonological loop performance becomes more impaired as intellectual ability decreases. While research shows that children as young as 3 years old store phonological information in working memory, active and efficient rehearsal within the phonological loop does not develop until later in childhood. It appears this happens around the time children begin to learn to read. In fact, some research suggests that problems with the phonological loop may be related to difficulty with reading acquisition, and this happened to a brother and a sister of mine. Both, one of them learned to read, and the other one, she can read. That's not the problem. The problem is she doesn't want to read, and this was her problem. Research on the function of the phonological loop in mathematics shows that the phonological loop is more important in mediating performance at an earlier age. And as far as my brother is concerned, he had impacted ears when he was very, very young. He had ear infections. It almost killed him when he was a baby. And this was way back. This is back in the late 40s. So the only antibiotics they had was penicillin, and they were there was not as much of it available as there probably should have been because of World War II. Anyway, not important. The Visuospatial sketchpad is the component of working memory responsible for spatial, visual, and possibly kinetic movement information. Just like the phonological loop system, the visuospatial system has a limited duration and is sensitive to interference from other visual information. This is not to say that the visuospatial and phonological systems are completely independent, because both systems are constrained by the overall limited capacity and duration of working memory. Research regarding the visuospatial sketchpad indicates it also has educational implications. Studies show that the functioning of the visuospatial system is important for maintaining an accurate line track when reading. It is also important for keeping the reader oriented to the text layout on a page. Further, it has been proposed that the visuospatial sketchpad may help us maintain a representation of the grammatical elements of a sentence from beginning to end so that accurate comprehension is possible. Recent research on visuospatial processing indicates that maintaining even a simple visual representation for more than a few seconds is very effortful. Successful representation of the item requires constant refocusing of attention. The purposeful direction of attention places strong demands on the last of our three components of working memory, the central executive. The central executive is a supervisory system of working memory managing the allocation of resources. Depending on the nature of the task, the central executive may tap the phonological loop, the visuospatial sketchpad, or both. It also controls the use of information from sensory memory, the retrieval of information from long-term memory, and the integration of such information with reasoning or planning tasks. Its responsibilities are like those of a company executive, taking little part in the actual work of the system, but providing much needed direction and overall vision. The functions of the central executive system are the least understood of the components of the working memory, largely because these functions are complex and many. The central executive is responsible not only for the directing attention and integrating information from other memory systems, but also for planning and directing future thinking and behavior. If we go back to the mind as computer metaphor represented earlier, the central executive is like the central processing unit of a computer. The CPU is responsible for retrieving appropriate information from the hard drive, running the appropriate programs, and producing a usable output. Researchers have looked extensively for a specific region in the brain where this CPU-like system might be located, and much evidence points toward the frontal lobes as important to central executive processes. People who have damage to the frontal lobes show significant problems across a wide range of cognitive and behavioral processes. Collectively, these processes are known as executive functions. As you can see in the list, problems with any of all of these functions could negatively influence classroom performance. And this I took from the book, Executive Functioning Skills, Directing Long-Term Memory Storage and Retrieval, Inhibition of Reflexive Behavioral Responses, Directing Attention and Filtering Extraneous Information, Interrupting and Returning to an Ongoing Activity, Regulating Social Behavior, including empathic responses, modifying motor behavior based on feedback, shifting cognitive resources based on task demands. Information in working memory is not intended to last for a significant period of time. Sometimes information is moved to the long-term store. At other times, information is simply lost or replaced. Multiple theories have been proposed to explain this phenomenon, but the two most investigated are decay theory and interference theory. Decay theory asserts that over time, information not actively rehearsed or transferred to long-term memory will gradually weaken and fade away. Another popular theory about why we easily lose information from working memory is called interference theory. This theory maintains that memories do not simply decay over time. Instead, the information becomes interfered with by older memories or incoming information. Long-term memory is an important part of the processing system as it is responsible for the relatively permanent storage of information. This type of storage system allows us to retain memories of our past experiences, which can be brought back into working memory for additional processing. It is because of our long-term store that we can learn from our experiences. The information of long-term memories, knowledge, has traditionally been the goal of education. Yet, moving information into the long-term store and retrieving it on demand is often quite difficult. The capacity of long-term memory is similar to sensory memory that it appears to be virtually unlimited. Investigation of some of the oldest people alive indicate that they are still capable of storing new information in the long-term store. The duration of long-term memory also appears to be unlimited. Again, as we grow old, most of us maintain vivid memories of life experiences across many years. And I was just with a group of older individuals, people potentially older than I am, and I was listening to them talk about people that had lived in the little town that I live in. And it was fascinating because they not only remembered who they were, but they remembered who they were connected with and who their cousins were. And it was all these strange connections. And these people were in their 80s, and here they are. They're just picking these little pieces of information out, and talking about people that used to live, two doors down and over on the other side of town, things like that. It was really kind of interesting, and I told them, this is what I'm talking about in class. The problems we experience recalling specific information are not based in the capacity of duration of long-term memory. Instead, problems are usually associated with organizational and relational issues. Without sophisticated storage procedures, the vast warehouse of long-term memory would be inaccessible. Elaboration refers to the idea of making connections between material you are trying to learn and information already known. These known memories, located within the long-term store, basically provide an anchor for the new information you are trying to learn. Making direct attempts to elaborate information you are learning can have dramatic effects on your ability to recall the information. Using elaboration is not always an easy process. In fact, elaboration is a skill, and like all skills, the more time and effort spent practicing, the more expert one becomes. Teachers can help students learn to elaborate through examples, but ultimately it is the student who is in the best position to make connections between new material and the wealth of information they already know. By linking new information to knowledge we already have in long-term memory, we create tags or handles by which we can easily grasp the information at a later date. These memory tags are essentially a method of organizing our experiences according to what we already know. Each new learning situation is almost immediately compared to existing memories for similarities and differences. Much of how we organize information into the long-term store depends on elaborative thinking. We learn about a civil war in another country and recognize similarities to our own civil war. We learn new vocabulary and language arts and immediately notice similar root words. We learn a new sport and realize the necessary skills are very different from any other that we have played. In this way, we naturally organize our world, creating an integrated body of knowledge. Humans are incredible organizers. If presented with information in random order, we will spontaneously organize the information into related groups. We can also take advantage of pre-organized information, learning new material more efficiently when it is presented in an organized manner. And there was a whole section on textbooks and why it's important to put textbooks together the way that they do. I didn't include any of that because I thought it was self-serving. I felt like they were just trying to sell me a new textbook, which they did. This is a brand new textbook. As a matter of fact, it doesn't come out until next year. So congratulations. This is the latest in educational psychology. Information to be learned is just one of many pieces of information running through working memory at a given point in time. Now, the thing about using a textbook that has never been used before is that there's no supplemental material. So I have to come up with all this stuff myself, which is taking a little bit of time. So if you think I'm running a little bit behind, it's because I have to create all of this stuff myself. I have two textbooks. I've got a physical textbook and I've got one online. And I'm trying to put all this stuff together. Of course, I've been doing this for 30 years, so I'm okay. So far, I'm okay. And I always make up my own tests, and I always make up my own discussion questions. So if I fall a little bit behind, that's probably why. A wide variety of environmental cues may become unintentionally associated with the new. This may make it difficult to access the information if the learning environment differs substantially from the testing environment. As educators move toward more collaborative and natural learning environments, it should be noted that assessments are still largely conducted in traditional formats. Teachers can facilitate student learning by trying to be more sensitive to how well the learning environment corresponds to the testing environment. Carefully elaborating and organizing learning material makes it easier to later recall, but there are still times when we are unable to recall something that we have learned. Some theorists have proposed that the memories can be lost from long-term memory in the same way that they are lost from working memory through the processes of interference or decay. Others hold that information is not displaced or gone, rather forgetting occurs due to insufficient retrieval cues to prompt recall. Recall that decay occurs when the memory trace weakens and is lost over time. According to this theory, once a memory has decayed, it is gone from the permanent store and is no longer available for recall. The idea that memories might decay in long-term memory, just as they do in short-term memory, is supported by the fact that we are more likely to forget with the passage of time. Studies show that once we have learned something such as a list of words and then forget the list, it is much easier to relearn the same list than it is to learn a new list of words. There is more research support for the idea that interference plays a role in forgetting information in long-term memory. Recall that interference occurs when a memory is displaced by other information. Sorry. In the long-term store, either older memories or newly learned information can interfere with recall. The earlier memory can interfere with your attempts to recall the information. This type of interference is called proactive interference. So if it's something from before, it's proactive. So if it's old information that's messing up your learning new information, that's proactive. That's the problem I'm having with Canvas, is the fact that Blackboard was so easy to use, and now they've given us Canvas to use, and I'm The information from Blackboard is interfering with the information from Canvas. And there's a lot of differences between the two. Hopefully you guys don't have to run into any of this stuff. But what I'm running into is that Blackboard, everything's on one page, and with Canvas, it skips from page to page. And I don't like that. I want it to be on one page. Anyway, we'll figure it out. Eventually, of course, we'll get used to Canvas, and it will work just as well as Blackboard did. A newly learned piece of information may interfere with the recall of an older memory. Retroactive interference occurs when new information interferes with recall of previously learned information. Proactive interference occurs when past learning affects future learning, and retroactive interference occurs when newer learning affects past learning. Both types of interference have been shown to play a significant role in forgetting from the long-term store. And of course, that's what this is all about. She's telling him that he needs to buy shampoo, milk, and cleaners. She keeps repeating it, and he says, "I got it." And then he sees this young lady's new jeans, and he forgets everything. So the new information, her jeans, has interfered with his memory. A lack of retrieval cues may influence whether we are able to recall a specific piece of information. A retrieval cue is simply information or some aspect of the environment that helps you recall a memory. If you have ever walked down the hall to get something and then drawn a complete blank about what you were supposed to be looking for, you're not alone. This happens more and more as you get older. That's why Bart's grandfather is having so much trouble. You may have had to walk back to wherever you were and maybe even re-engage in whatever task you had been working on before you can remember the item. Usually it's not that bad for me anyway. This is an example. He doesn't have his shoes on, I don't think. This is an example of what happens when you don't have the appropriate retrieval cues to access specific information. The issue of retrieval cues underscores the importance of developing effective encoding skills. Remembering information is strongly related to how we learn the information in the first place. Sometimes we memorize information in a specific way, encoding specificity. Multiple choice exams provide retrieval cues which may allow you to recognize the learned information as long as the memory tags you used match the cues provided in the question. Essay-based tests, on the other hand, require you to recall information in long-term memory with fewer retrieval cues. Successful retention of life experiences leads to an accumulation of information over time. This accumulation of information results in knowledge. Knowledge is formed in systematic and organized fashion. If all our memories were stored in a simplistic organizational structure, perhaps in the order they were learned, recall would be difficult and extremely time-consuming. Declarative knowledge is information that can be stated or declared. Think about the information you are learning in this class or the conversation you had with your roommate about your date. All these situations involve the use of declarative knowledge, things you know and can easily state. Declarative knowledge can be subdivided into two types, episodic and semantic. Episodic knowledge is personal information that is tied to a specific time and place. Episodic memory is a personal memory grounded in events which took place in a specific time and place. These episodic memories are a rich documentary of your life and are clearly tied to locations and specific times in your life. Semantic knowledge is made up of memories for specific facts, regardless of the time and place the facts were learned. The knowledge that lions are mammals is a semantic memory. Semantic knowledge allows us to apply meaning to the word lion without basing that meaning on a location or specific time in our life. Much of our knowledge appears to operate in this manner, and we appear to organize related semantic memories into schema. Research shows that our schemas may actually influence what we think, see, or hear as we go about our lives. By using existing schema, we can respond to incomplete information in appropriate ways. The schema allows us to behave as expected despite incomplete information. By using existing schema, we can respond to incomplete information in appropriate ways. Building upon schema-based research, knowledge experts and neuroscientists have begun to develop an even more elaborate framework for understanding semantic knowledge called semantic networks. Semantic networks are representational structures designed to explain the relation between items within a schema. And this is an example of a schema. Farm, there are farm machines, there are farm crops, and there are farm animals. Part of the animals are horses, cows, goats, and sheep. Some of the crops are corn, wheat, and doesn't have soybeans, and some of the machines are tractors and trucks. The semantic network model assumes that our knowledge is highly interconnected and that recall of any particular item causes a more general activation of all related concepts. Graphically, this activation is represented by a series of interconnected nodes. The nodes are specific elements within the semantic network representing concepts like people or world. The connections represent the activation trends occurring after a particular node is activated. A longer line means it takes a longer period of time to activate the next node. In general, the graphical model is created such that longer connectors mean a weaker connection between the two nodes. Over time, the conceptual basis for semantic networks have been broadened to incorporate newer research on brain anatomy and physiology. These newer theories have gone beyond theoretical networks and have based knowledge storage and retrieval on our understanding of how the brain actually works. This led to the development of connectionist networks and parallel distributed processing theories. Connectionist network theorists have related knowledge storage and retrieval to the actual functioning of the neuron. Procedural knowledge is typically referred to as how-to knowledge because it involves knowledge of how to perform certain actions. Sometimes we can perform an activity that we cannot describe in words, like that bicycle that we're looking at. The difficulty in verbally describing how to ride a bicycle is typical of procedural knowledge because this type of knowledge is not coded verbally. Instead, it is coded as an automated sequence of actions that have to change as a function of environmental demands. And of course, I'm looking at that and thinking, how in the world did he ever get up there to begin with? A knowledge to consider is conditional knowledge, or knowledge about the appropriate application of procedural and declarative information. For example, think about how you speak to children versus how you speak to your peers. You make substantial changes to both the content and structure of your speech, depending on the audience. Conditional knowledge allows you to know which conditions necessitate the use of specific actions. A teacher's conditional knowledge is highly important for effective teaching. When students experience difficulty with a particular lesson, how does the teacher know how to help them? Over time, successful teachers build a conditional knowledge base of teaching techniques that work for children with very different individual learning needs over a variety of situations. Advancement of this type of knowledge helps novice teachers move toward becoming expert teachers. Mnemonics is a word generally used to improve memory. Mnemonics are used to enhance recall of memories from our declarative knowledge base. As we discussed earlier, we naturally organize our memories when we transfer them to long-term memory. This organization, however, varies widely in quality and effectiveness. Like most skills, we learn to organize information in such a way as to make it more accessible later. Mnemonics are techniques that organize information via specific forms of elaboration. Elaboration is the process of connecting new information to information already well learned. The particular type of elaboration varies according to the mnemonic used. The most common mnemonic is the acronym approach. This approach works well with simple lists. To help memorize the information, the first letter of each item on the list is taken and rearranged to form a familiar word. In keeping with the notion of elaboration, the idea is that the word you form is very familiar to you and difficult to forget. If you can create a strong association between the acronym and the list, the familiarity with the word will help you recall the list. And this is TGIF, of course. TGIF stands for Thank Goodness It's Friday. Another one from a long, long time ago was LSMFT, Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. That was an advertising ploy, LSMFT. And of course, they always said LSMFT at the beginning of the commercial or advertisement, and they said it at the end. And pretty soon, everybody knew what LSMFT meant. It meant Lucky Strike means fine tobacco because they told you about it over and over and over again. The difficulty with the acronym approach is that this type of elaboration does not require a very meaningful association between the material to be learned and the information in long-term memory. Mnemonics that use visual imagery are also very effective in facilitating recall. Visual mnemonics create a visual code for the information being learned in addition to the more common auditory code. This dual code approach enhances elaboration and facilitates recall. One common type of visual mnemonic is the method of loci. This is a memorization approach that is excellent for learning items that can be visualized. And this word right here, loci or Loki, and I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. We're not talking about Loki, the Scandinavian god. We're talking about loci, which means locus or place. But I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, so I may be mispronouncing it. You'll need to look it up in order to pronounce it correctly. Something I should have done before I started my lecture. Another popular visual technique is the keyword method. This mnemonic is particularly useful if you are trying to use a visualization technique for remembering more abstract words. To use this approach, you first think of an easily visualized word that sounds like the abstract word you are trying to remember. This easily visualized word becomes the keyword, acting as the key or gateway to the phonetically similar abstract word. Next, you relate the definition of the abstract word to the keyword. At this point, recall of the keyword should lead to the associated definition. Another way to improve memory and build a solid knowledge base is to create automated sources of knowledge. This is particularly true for procedural memories. Procedural knowledge consists of how to memories. That's what it's supposed. This is okay. Like how to ride a bicycle. The development of a procedural knowledge takes practice before it becomes automatic. Often we need to break complex activities into smaller parts so that students can practice individual steps before being able to perform a complex activity. Cursive writing is at first slow and laborious. With practice, it becomes an automatic process that requires little thought. The same is true for other types of procedural knowledge, from dribbling a basketball to typing on a keyboard for everybody except me because I type with 2 fingers. Thus, accessing procedural knowledge becomes automatic over time, leaving more of our limited cognitive resources available for other tasks. Think about how often you engage in a procedural activity like driving a car, while simultaneously engaging in another task like carrying on a conversation or reading a map for navigation. Hopefully, you're not driving and reading your map at the same time. It is relatively easy for most individuals to think about a wide range of things while riding a bike or driving a car because these activities do not require active cognitive resources. You are able to use your procedural knowledge without having to actively think about it. The path to automation of procedural memories begins with the cognitive stage. At this point in the process, each step of the procedure still requires active cognitive resources. We still must think about each step in the procedure. The associative stage is automating the procedural knowledge. The final step in this process is the uh, autonomous stage. This stage is the final integration of the whole process into one cohesive unit. Automated scripts occur quite frequently as we go about our daily lives. Think about the last time you drove a car. Many students in a classroom may feel overwhelmed at the beginning of the school year, finding it difficult to manage a new, complicated daily routine. Teachers can assist students in developing automated knowledge regarding the daily routine by breaking the day into steps or component parts and making sure that they deviate as little as possible from the set routine during the initial stages of learning. Automation allows students to divert more cognitive resources toward their studies and daily activities instead of having to focus on what is supposed to be happening next. We were just talking about driving a car. If you think about it, people who live in cities and ride buses all the time don't drive cars. And of course, that that's the only way you can get around uh, in the country. And you guys live on the reservation, and I live in rural Iowa. So the whole concept of not knowing how to drive a car is just totally alien to me. Teachers can help students develop conditional knowledge by providing consistent feedback regarding behavior. Another problem, another interesting problem. One of our cars, I drive a sports car. My wife drives an automatic, and we have a truck that's an automatic. So sometimes when I'm driving her manual transmission or her automatic transmission car, I try to shift gears, which is you can't do, of course. But my sports car is a 6 speed, so that's a little interesting. Anyway, yeah, that's got 6 speeds, and of course it's all automatic as far as my brain is concerned. I just drove from about 80 miles south of here to a soccer game, and shifting gears the whole way, and it was a blast. I really enjoy driving a manual transmission vehicle. Anyway, students need appropriate feedback across many situations to begin to appreciate the situational specificity of their actions. Classroom behavior depends on conditional knowledge. Most students develop an understanding of what actions are appropriate in the classroom in the early grades. Teaching students how to raise their hand to speak, wait in line, or ask for assistance can be challenging, as these require a conditional knowledge store regarding a number of more ambiguous conditions. Cognitive diversity is defined as differences in thinking patterns, analysis, perceptions, and point of view. This definition reflects the fact that most of our thinking tools develop depending on our interactions with the world around us. These interactions are unique to each individual, but there are also generalizations that can be made to groups with common history, culture, biology, or perspective. And as I've told you over and over, I grew up in rural Indiana, which is a farming community, and a lot of my friends were their fathers were factory workers. So it's a very blue collar area. But people that grow up in wealthy areas, they have different cognitive diversity than people that grow up in rural areas. People that, the individual that doesn't drive a car, that doesn't even, can't even conceive of transporting themselves from one place to another by themselves. They're just used to somebody else driving, riding on trains, riding on buses, getting a taxi. This whole Uber thing is a little interesting. People just get Uber. I just need to get an Uber, that kind of thing. A little strange to me anyway. Metacognition refers to a mental process everyone uses in their daily life, thinking about one's own thinking. Metacognition has traditionally been subdivided into at least two distinct processes, metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation, which often work together. Flavel in 1979 proposed that metacognitive knowledge was a distinct component of metacognition. Metacognitive knowledge is information that we acquire about how thinking occurs. Perhaps you have learned that studying in a lunchroom or common area is distracting, making it difficult for you to focus. When you study, you use this knowledge about your own cognitive processes to choose an appropriate environment for studying. This knowledge about your own thinking is only one subcomponent of metacognitive knowledge. Metacognitive knowledge can be further subdivided into three areas: knowledge about how we think, knowledge about the nature of a given task, and knowledge about what strategy to use for a given task. The first subcomponent of metacognitive knowledge is knowledge about how we think. Perhaps you know that you learn best visually. This knowledge is metacognitive, allowing us to think about our own thinking and set up the environmental conditions we know are effective. This aspect of metacognitive knowledge can be important for increasing learning, allowing us to recognize our own cognitive strengths and act accordingly. Usually this occurs naturally, and we begin to structure our environments to maximize learning. And this is what I try to do with my PowerPoints. I am a visual learner, and so I like to put pictures. I like pictures anyway, but I put a lot of pictures in. And hopefully, if you're a visual learner, this helps you remember some of the information that we're dealing with. Helps you understand it if you're a visual learner. If you're not a visual learner, well, maybe it helps you anyway. It certainly helps me put things together and allows me to deal with the lecture material a little bit easier. The second subcomponent of metacognitive knowledge is knowledge about specific task variables, such as having the knowledge that spelling sentences will take much longer to complete than a reading worksheet. This type of metacognitive knowledge allows students to allocate their time more effectively. In the same way, we know that we can read a popular magazine cover to cover in less time than it takes to read a chapter of a textbook. Without this knowledge regarding the specific task demands, we would have considerable difficulty managing our daily assignments. And this is one of the things that I have to do every week. One of the things that I have to do is put this lecture together. I'm only a week ahead, and in educational psychology, because nobody's ever dealt with this textbook before. So one of the things I have to do, I have to grade your discussions, which I'm behind on. I have to put together the lecture for educational psychology. I have to write the test for educational psychology. I have to write the discussion question for educational psychology. And I have to do all my other lectures, and I'm falling way behind on my lectures. But I have all the other classes I've taught before, so I'm falling back on some of my old lectures. Hopefully I'm falling back on some of my old lectures. I hope I am. The Canvas thing has really thrown a monkey wrench in things. This would be a lot easier semester if we hadn't started Canvas. If we were still using Blackboard, it would be just a piece of cake. But here we are trying to put Canvas together. I'm doing this class and all of those other things. And that's part of my metacognitive knowledge base. Of course, like I said, I've been doing this for 30 years. So it's maybe a little easier for me, somebody that has only been working in the field for 5 or 6 years, like Dr. Barber, or for 10 or 15 years like Dr. Russ, might be a little bit more difficult for them. The third component of metacognitive knowledge relates to strategy use. Metacognitive strategies involve our awareness of available strategies for completing a task or solving a problem. Metacognitive regulation involves evaluating the outcome of our efforts to use metacognitive strategies. This aspect of metacognition is essential for overseeing these processes and ensuring that a particular goal has been achieved. Metacognitive regulation is an important part of the learning process. Without regulation, learning would be inefficient, with individuals having little control over the effectiveness of their learning. Metacognitive regulation typically involves planning a learning strategy, monitoring the process, and evaluating the effectiveness of the process. And that's what we have: planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Research has documented that our ability to plan, monitor, and evaluate our learning develops over time as we become better at directing our own learning. Now, how did I ever find this? I just typed it into Google, and Google found the picture for me. I was lucky that this one is so demonstrative. Like most skills, there is a variation in the degree to which individuals naturally engage in metacognition. Most individuals engage in metacognition without explicit awareness of the process. However, providing explicit instruction in metacognition may prove effective. Typically, programs to enhance metacognitive abilities center on developing the ability to think in new and unique ways, to develop different strategies for approaching a task, and to better reflect on one's thinking. In addition to providing knowledge about how to use metacognitive thinking, it is also important to provide ample practice. Providing strategies without a structured program requiring practice typically results in less efficient cognitive control. It is important to remember that metacognition is a natural process which can be facilitated by explicit instruction, helping less successful students become more aware of and thereby better able to regulate their own learning processes. And as we go through these things, and you see all these dates that come up with all this research, okay, 87, 79, Flavel in 79. Remember, they had all this information. This is when he wrote it. When was it accepted? Maybe sometime in the 80s. And then they started putting it in textbooks. And of course, I've been reading in psychology since the middle 70s. So all of this information I've seen before. All this information I watched as it came into the knowledge base of psychology, as interesting as all that is. And you might not find that interesting at all, but I do. I mean, the whole idea that this information is new information. Oh, this isn't all that new. That's 30 years old. You know, it's not really all that new, but I've watched it change over time, evolve, as it were. That's kind of curious. And that is the end of the lecture. So I'll talk to you again next week. Chapter 6.